Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Biology Daily Booster. This is number 2 for our Paper 2 series. Do note it is an advanced information listed topic for those of you doing foundation biology. Just because it's not explicitly listed on the higher doesn't mean that we won't have questions on these topics, remember. What we're going to start off with then is just having a little bit of a consideration about what different things need to actually survive. So if we think about plants, then in order to survive they need a source of water, they need light, minerals, space and carbon dioxide. Obviously water and carbon dioxide for photosynthesis along with the light, the minerals for a range of different things like making chlorophyll, and space in order to grow. As far as animals are concerned, they need water, food, breeding partners so they can mate, territory and somewhere to shelter as well. Now, what we find is that as far as our plants and animals go, there's not always vast quantities of these things. Sometimes those materials are limited. In those situations, the organisms present have to compete for those resources. And what we find then is as the result of this competition, then the weaker one is either going to have to leave the area or it will die because it'll be outcompeted for that resource. We're going to need to know this word population here. When we refer to the population in biology, we're talking about the number of organisms of a particular species living in an area. And competition is going to have a direct effect on that population size. When we think about how these different organisms actually interact with one another within their community, then what we're really talking about is this idea of interdependence. Now, what we find as far as GCSE biology goes is that there are 3 ecological relationships we need to know. So 3 of these links between organisms in a community. First one is predation. Now, this is the relationship between predators and prey. This comes with our handy little graph at the bottom that hopefully you are familiar with. So on the little graph at the bottom, what we can hopefully see is there are 2 lines. So we have the red line, which is the one that goes a bit taller, and the blue line, the slightly shallower line. The red is the prey line, the blue are the predators. If they ask you to describe the shape of this graph, then what we'd be saying is that the population of hares increases, and then a short while later the population of lynx increases. You could talk about the fact that after the increase we see a decrease, etc. That's the describe. We're saying what we see. Key things, first of all talking about where their increases are, and secondly is referring to this idea that there is a lag between the change in one population and the change in the other. If the question was explain the shape of the graph, we'd still do our description first of all, but then we need to say why we get those. So the population of our hares is going up because if we look at the blue line at that point, there is only a low population of lynx, which means there's going to be fewer hares being eaten by their predator. Whereas as the hares go up, that means there's more food available for the lynx, so their population increases. And then, as the population of lynx has increased, that means that there's more of them eating the hares, so the hare population decreases. There's always going to be a slight delay between those two because it takes a while, obviously, for breeding to take place, or obviously for them to be eaten and reduce the population size. Option number 2 is the process we refer to as mutualism. Now, mutualism is where both of the organisms are going to benefit. And a good example here are the oxpeckers that are on buffalo. So oxpeckers are a type of bird. They sit quite happily on buffaloes. The oxpeckers are basically feeding off the parasites living on the buffaloes. So buffalo benefits because there's less parasites on them. Oxpeckers benefit because nothing's going to try and eat them if they're on the back of a buffalo. And then third one, parasitism. This is where only the parasite benefits. The host is going to suffer as a result of this relationship. Best example, tapeworms. Tapeworm is the parasite, so it quite happily embeds itself in the wall of your intestines and then feeds on everything you eat. So the tapeworm gets a lovely environment to live in, it gets a nice source of food from everything you're eating. You, however, are not getting the nutrients you need. You are going to suffer as a result. We need to know about two types of pyramid. The first one, the pyramid of numbers, is just as the name suggests. It is a pyramid showing the number of each of those trophic level species. Because it's about the number, then quite simply the length of the bar tells us how many organisms there are. This means we won't always have a pyramid-shaped pyramid of numbers. Our little example on the left here, that is a pyramid shape, because at the bottom are producers, they're clover, there's going to be loads of them, so that's got quite a wide bar. Snails, there'll be slightly fewer, thrush, fewer, sparrowhawk, even less. So what we see is we do get a pyramid shape there. On the right though, this one, we can see we only have a very small bar for the producer because it's a single oak tree. So we only have one oak tree, but on that oak tree are potentially hundreds, if not thousands of insects. So that next bar is going to be much wider because it's feeding on a really quite a big tree, but there's only one of them, so small bar at the bottom. The second type of pyramid that is always pyramid shaped is the pyramid of biomass. Biomass, if you remember, is the amount of living material. So what we actually find here is each level of our trophic, each level for our trophic levels will take not only the population into account, but also the size of the organism. So this is for our oak tree still, but there's one oak tree, but because of the size of it, then our biomass is larger, hence the large bar at the bottom. Caterpillars, there might be loads more than a single oak tree, but they've got a much lower size. So overall their biomass is less than the oak tree, and it continues up. If you are asked to draw a pyramid of numbers or a pyramid of biomass, they are usually going to give you a bit of graph paper to do this. Reason for that is that you need to pick an appropriate scale. So look at the numbers they've given you, look at the size of the bit of graph paper, pick something that fits easily. Always make sure that your producer is at the bottom, so the bottom bar is always your producer, and then build your way up moving through the food chain. Final thing to do is once you've drawn it, make sure that you do label each of the bars with what it represents. So you can write it in the bars if it fits, or just off to the side with obviously a little line taking it in there, just so it makes it clear which one it relates to. How do we calculate biomass then? Well, we'll take samples of organisms from each trophic level. We'll then calculate their average mass, and then from the average mass, multiply it up to the population size. So that gives us the total biomass. So this is drawing on a bit of our Unit 6 knowledge where we can do sampling. So we don't literally count every organism within the area. You take a sample, you work out obviously what that would mean for the entire area as a population. Average mass times population size gives us total biomass. What we tend to use is something we refer to as the dry mass of an organism. The reason for that is the water content is going to vary. So if we're recording the mass of an organism that's just spent the past 10 minutes just drinking down at the local water source, it's going to have a greater mass than the one that hasn't bothered drinking yet today. So that wouldn't give us a true representation of the actual mass of the organism. What we do then is, in order to get the dry mass, we do have to kill it because we're going to be drying it. So obviously we don't like to do this with large quantities because that's quite wasteful with wildlife, but to get the dry mass you would have to kill it, which is the downside of course. What we find then is as we go through these food chains, what we're actually doing is we're transferring energy from one organism to another. We start off with our sunlight, remember, because our producers use sunlight in order to make their initial biomass. But in terms of how much of that sunlight actually makes it to the chemical stores of our plant, it's a tiny amount, about 1%. The rest of it gets reflected off the leaf, etc. Once we've actually made the biomass in our plant, then it's not a guarantee it all makes it to the next level either. Because at each level that we are moving through our food chain, we are losing a certain proportion of that energy and that biomass. The key ways that we lose biomass as we go through a food chain then. First of all, not everything is eaten. It's not like if a rabbit is eating some grass, it then digs up the roots to make sure it gets every little morsel of it. So roots, bones tend to be leftovers. Still biomass of the organism, but we're not taking it into the next level. Some of it will be used in respiration, and then we've got two processes beginning with the letter E, egestion and excretion. Egestion is basically the poop side, so this is where we've got undigested material lost as feces, and excretion is the wee. So these are our waste products lost from the body, such as urine. If they ask you ways that biomass is lost, not all of it is eaten, some used in respiration, egestion, excretion. There's your 4 possible answers. Because we're seeing this loss at each of those levels of the food chain, there's a limit to how many trophic levels can exist. And what we find is they tend to be limited to just 4 trophic levels. If we tried to go beyond 4 trophic levels, we just wouldn't have enough energy being passed on to support life at that next stage. There is one calculation they can ask you to do, which is the efficiency of biomass transfer. This is a percentage. So it's the biomass available after the transfer, which could be in grams or kilograms, and you divide that by the biomass available before the transfer, and then because we need it as a percentage, times by 100. So just make sure that they're both in the same units, either grams or kilograms, doesn't really matter, and then make sure you times by 100 to get the percentage. Because this is a biology paper, there is no guarantee they would give you that formula, so just make sure you remember biomass after divided by biomass before times 100. If there are any bits from today's booster you want to go over in more detail, of course there's the videos on the main channel, you've got your revision guides, hopefully your class workbooks as well. Do have a look at some past questions, and of course don't forget to join us for our daily booster tomorrow.